All right, guys, so this week we are picking up and we are going to be talking about God's infinite nature. So last time we met, we were talking about the essence of God in general. So I don't have the slides up, but we did talk about how God is the great I am. God is being. We talked about light and glory as manifestations of God's resplendence. And we also talked about kind of the difference between nature and essence, and kind of waved our hands a bit and said, you know what? We, for the purposes of this study, are just going to be explaining who God is from the Bible, and we're going to not worry so much about some of the technical terms and the arguments that philosophers have about these things. We're just going to talk about God in terms of how the Bible explains him to us. And so picking up on that line, this week we're going to be starting out talking about God's infinite nature. So within the study of Ichthus, we have God's infinite nature and God's perfect character are kind of the subheadings that we're going to be going through next in our sequence here. And this week is God's infinite nature. So here are the subpoints that we're going to be going through. We're going to start out just the general introduction that he's infinite and what that means for us. We're going to talk about how God is spiritual, eternal, and immeasurable in a spatial sense. And then we're going to talk about how these things, essential attributes of God, make God unique. And he's also unique because of how they manifest in creation. And so that's where the omnipotence, the omniscience, and the omnipresence comes from. And so that's the general structure of what we're going to go through here today. And as we go, this middle section here about how God is unique, this is the transition between these first three, which are the so-called essential qualities of God. This is God independent from creation, if you will. And then the latter three are how these qualities manifest in how God relates to creation. And so that's kind of what the middle section there is going through. All right, so that first point for us to make is simply this, that God's nature is infinite. And this is actually a decidedly difficult concept for us as humans to understand because we as humans are not infinite. Now, God's infinity, which is infinity in every way and according to any conceivable true standard. So it's not like God's just really big. He's not a super creature. He's not, something that we can honestly contextualize. We don't have a reference for a being that is truly infinite. But God's infinity for us is a clarifying concept in that it illuminates his abilities. So when we talk about God's character, which is what will come next in the study, we'll talk about how God's perfect character illuminates his motives, the reasons behind how he operates in creation. But God's infinity illuminates his abilities. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is about how God is spiritual. And so in being spiritual, God's being transcends the physical universe. He's not limited or bounded by material concerns or issues. God is not subject to matter in any way. He's not made of matter because God created matter and employs it however he desires. And so this is the first of these essential qualities that we're talking about. So spiritual, eternal, and immeasurable. Those are the three we're going through first. And this one is talking specifically about matter. And so when we say matter, we're talking about the things that are created in the material universe. So the world and everything in it, the second and third heavens, if you will, that's how the Bible describes them. So, our solar system, the galaxies, everything in the universe that has substance is what we're getting at here. And when we say that God is spiritual, God is separate from that. He is separate from that which has been created, the stuff, if you will, in the universe, because he is a completely spiritual being. Now, one thing that I thought maybe it would be good for us to talk about just a little bit is how God being spiritual is different than angels being spiritual. And so, Audie, I know that's a little bit jumping ahead in the systematic theology. Dr. Lumba has an entire section of the study dedicated to angels. But do you have anything you want to say on regards to God's spirituality versus angels, which aren't quite the same as us and how they relate to space-time?
Yeah, I do. I want to say, first of all, that if anything is created, it's made of stuff. And the Lord is not created, so he's not made of stuff. So when we think in terms of spirit, we might be feeling like this is other than material, and there is some sense to that. but it is not strictly correct
Mm-hmm.
because everything that exists is made of stuff. So it is all really material in a sense of speaking. And that's actually why we're not looking forward to a smoky, hazy sort of heaven or
Whoops. Well, we'll see if he comes back in a sec.
yeah, it's a smoky
Okay.
sort of heaven or the new universe, a place where things are not material. That's not the idea. We saw that angels could take in food, even though the Lord could as well. When he came to visit with Abraham, with the angels, we saw that they could interact with matter and physical matter, and they could eat food and they could have all of these experiences. We have Genesis 6 that talks about the rebel angels creating the Nephilim with human women and all of that. So that suggests to us that they're made of a different sort of material than the rest of the universe is, but it is still material.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea. But the Lord, when we say that the Lord is spiritual, we're necessarily saying that he is not material. So his spirituality is essentially in contrast to the universe. The spirituality of the angels is not in contrast to the universe. It's in contrast to other material things, other physical things. And the way that the Bible presents it, it keeps using the word that is also translatable as wind. We find that kind of issue with different modern translations. Instead of saying spirit, they would say wind. And in some places, instead of saying, not just modern translations, I think even the KJV has that issue. So in some places you will see spirit, in some places you would see wind, because the word is not really distinguishable from each other. The idea here is that just as wind does have an effect on matter around it, and yet you can't see it, you can't really touch it, it's not tangible, that's how these creatures are. So the spirituality of angels is in contrast to the other material creations in the universe. In fact, this is one way to look at it, that unless man had been created, angels would have been the only thing of their kind in the entire universe. Every other thing had either flesh and bones if they were animals, or they had a physicality to them that the angels did not have. It classed them separately from everything that existed. So when man was created, note what the Bible says, that he was made a little lower than the angels. That's actually speaking to the fact that man was more like all creatures of the earth than he was like the angels. So the spirituality of the angels was essentially to set them apart from everything else that God had made. And the spirituality of God is to contrast God as a thing with the universe as a thing.
And so that was the essential point that we're trying to draw a contrast between here. And I think you did a good job explaining it, that God's spirituality is completely distinct from anything that's created. So humans are creatures, angels are creatures, both have been created by the creator who is external to that which is created. And maybe that sounds really technical, but I think Audie's done a good job explaining some of the points. Just a couple other things to bring up in regards to this. Angels, this physicality aspect is one of the reasons why Genesis 6 was a thing. It's one of the reasons why angels inhabit some of the creatures in the Gospels, like going into the pigs. That word actually gets transliterated a lot of different ways, but the Gerasenes or the Gadarenes, at that particular instance, is angels have this desire for physicality. Dr. Luganbill discusses this in various parts of his studies. And the other point that I wanted to bring up in regards to this is that before humans were even created in the universe had been created and was inhabited by angels. And so this is the sons of God, as they're called. I believe it's in Job somewhere, talks about how the sons of God sang during creation, right? Angels have this materiality to them, even though they are different than us, but God is completely separate. All right, so with that, I think we're going to take a question here, and we'll pick back up in a second. All right, so a good question that we just got was, well, if angels are already kind of this different state than us, why are they kind of looking down, so to speak. And if humans were created a little lower than the angels, Adi was quoting that passage, then why do angels want that? This physical experience. And I think my answer, just to start us off, and like I said, I'll certainly let others jump in, is just that angels want things that they don't have. And so if angels don't have this sensory experience, the actual physicality. Now, I should note that it's a little bit dangerous for us to get too off in the weeds about saying, well, angels did this for this and that reason. The Bible doesn't talk so explicitly about some of this. Dr. Luganville has done a good job on this explaining hypotheses for the motivations here. So, for example, before the universe was destroyed and remade, he hypothesizes certain things about angels kind of messing with the genetic code of the creatures, the fauna on the pre-Reconstruction Earth, as well as angels desiring the bodies of things, generally speaking, as it shows up in the Gospels. And my initial answer would just be because it's something that they lack. And sort of grass is always greener sentiment is because of that. That's why, even though having this mortal coil, to use that phrasing that the KJV does, makes us weaker and less powerful, we still have that sensory experience. And that's something that the angels wanted to experience themselves, I suppose. Audie, do you have thoughts to add on top of that?
I think you really actually said what the issue is. Every time we're tempted, the idea is that what we don't have is better than what we do have. So why would they want it? Well, because they didn't trust that God gave them what they should have, that what they had was good, and that God had, put them in the right state for them to be. And that's why this whole fight we have is a fight of faith, a fight of trusting that what God does is good, that he loves us, and that what he gives to us is good for us. It's exactly what happened with Adam and Eve. They had the fountain of wisdom himself coming to walk with them every evening. They had a perfect garden. Everything was great. But somehow they thought that the one thing that God said, that's not good for you, was what they needed more than anything once Satan suggested it to them. So the fact that anyone wants something, no matter how wise, powerful, smart, or whatever they might be, does not in any way indicate that that thing was actually better for them than what they had. It's not at all the way to think about things. So yeah, the angels wanted it simply because they could, not because there was anything to suggest that what they had was not superior to what they were looking for.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to a certain extent, this is the irrationality of sin. I know I've explained it this way. I don't want to get super philosophical about it, but when the Bible calls Jesus the divine logos, that word meaning reason, I mean, it means many things in Greek, but God's universe is ordered and logical. And fundamentally, all sin is irrational. And so to the question of why did the angels seem to desire something that's lower than the estate that they currently possess, it seems kind of like mad, right? Well, why does Satan rebel against God? Why do any of us rebel against God? Maybe that isn't the most intellectually satisfying of answers, but it really does get to the heart of this, I think, is that just because angels are bigger and smarter than us, so to speak, doesn't mean that they don't suffer from the same spiritual blindness than we do. And that spiritual blindness causes us to do things that a more objective third-party observer would say are irrational. And in this particular case, this is one such instance where, by all accounts, elect angels don't have this same desire, temptation to do all of this. And so it's just transgression of the created order in a matter that we would term irrational. So I think that is kind of the way in which we ought to approach this issue. Not so much that the angels are doing it for any great purpose, like there isn't more behind it in a plan, as it's something that they don't have that they want. And sin is always, in some sense, irrationally breaking God's natural order.
Yeah. I would say that I actually find the answer pretty intellectually satisfying myself, because all it says really is we always want something because we think it's better than what we have. And that's just true. We have that experience all the time. It's very rare for people to go, I want something, and that something is a change of the order, the state in which you are, and it's not because, as in, you don't think that what you want is better than what you currently have. I mean, we have too many. If we were to go into all the experiences that demonstrate this, we'd probably spend the whole night on this, and there is no need for that. So we could move on at the, I think. Yeah.
Sure. All right. So with that, I think that's where we're going to stop on our initial discussion of how God being spiritual means he is set apart, distinct from the universe. He transcends it in a way that even angels do not, even though angels are above us in station for the time being, as Hebrews talks about, is that God, even more than that, because he is not a created being, because he's not a created creature, God is completely separate from matter. And that makes him unique in this characteristic, as we will see for all of the other things that we talk about next. All right, so next we're going to be talking about how God is eternal. And so what we just spent time covering was how God is not bound by matter or the material universe because God is spiritual. And now we're talking about how God is not bound by time. So God's being transcends time. He's not limited or bounded by temporal issues or concerns. God is not subject to time in any way. God is not constrained by time because God created time and employs it however he desires. And so this is one of those things where, again, we as humans are just going to have a hard time wrapping our heads around exactly what it means to be outside of time, because it's not a state in which we have any personal experience in. Plus, when you say something like before time even existed, the concept of before is inherently wrapped up in time, right? If we view time as kind of like a line, then before is like more left on the line. Well, for a being that's outside of time, there is no before. There is no after, because time is not something that that being is bound by. And this is really hard for us to wrap in our minds. I would not feel discouraged if thinking about this sometimes causes you to get confused, because it confuses me. It's just not even something that we honestly need to worry ourselves about to the greatest degree. We just need to understand that some of the concerns that test us and temper us in life about not seeing how things are going to play out, about this uncertain future, about not knowing how the chips are going to fall, God is not constrained in that same way. God's plan sees from the very beginning to the very end of the history of the universe, it sees everything in an instant. God planned everything before the initial events of creation were ever set in motion. And that is very foreign to our limited way of thinking, because we think on imperfect information, but God does not. And so this is what we mean by God being eternal, is that he sees the end from the beginning. He is simply not bound by the constraints of time that we are. Ade, do you have points you want to bring up in reference to this?
Yeah, sure. I think the very first thing that we want to note is what time is. Physicists are having a hard time actually explaining what time is, especially since Einstein basically blew everybody's mind when he made it clear that time was not a constant. When he discovered that time was not the constant it was thought to be. Well, time is really the measure of change, and God doesn't change. So obviously there was nothing to measure that change. If time exists for a being that does not change, it is actually a nonsensical concept. It really does not mean anything, So the first thing I would say is that the very meaning of time does not apply to God, since it's actually the measure of change. And the second thing I would say is that God's eternality is explained entirely by the fact that he is that which is. So there is no was with God in the sense of him, because if you look to God's past, what you see is the same thing that you see now. And if you look to his future, what you see is the same thing that you see now. There is no transformation in the state of his existence. But that does not mean that because God is outside And when we use that word, we have to construct, we have to create mental constructs for trying to make sense of God. So when we say outside of time, we have this feeling like there is a box in which time operates and God exists outside of it. But God is acting. He is doing things. And when he does things, there's a question, how does his doing things interact with the fact that time exists outside of, or rather that time does not affect him? Is he not actually doing something, basically changing something? And that is where I would bring in the analogy of the software engineer and his software. He's changing states without actually being affected in any way by those changes. He might create an input in a particular program he has designed, and he gets a certain output. He might make changes to the state of the program and all of that, but he himself is not in any way changed by it. So we the creatures that God made had to have a context within which we exist. He does not need context. He does not need anything. In himself, he is perfectly complete. So eternity, in fact, is just like, would I say space? Eternity is like an expression of him, rather than something that he exists within. That is, it is his own type of time. No, eternity is actually like, this is an aspect of myself. That's what it is. So likewise, for us to appreciate God's eternality, we first of all appreciate that he does not change, and therefore time is meaningless to him, to the quality of his existence. There's no change to measure. But in order to interact with us and to bring about the state of things that he wants, he has created time to allow us to exist within a certain context and to work out what he has intended. So time is for us. It is for our benefit. Otherwise, we couldn't make sense of life.
Right. And I think fundamentally the point is that time is created. God created time, right? It's not like it's some aspect within which he works, like you said, because it is fundamentally tied up with existence, like you brought up. Time is something that was created as part of the creation of the universe. Bringing back up the physicists, there's this thing, relativity is this idea. Space is linked to time. The two things are not unrelated. It is very much part of creation. And again, we have a really hard time understanding exactly what that means for God not having that. But it is just very important for us to emphasize that God is not bound by it because God created it. And really, I think that is more or less the gist of what we have to say on this matter, is simply that even though it's hard for us to understand and conceptualize, God is separate from time. And that means that how he approaches the sequence of events that happen in the material universe is very fundamentally different from how we, as finite creatures who don't have that externality to time, can approach things. All right, good question here. Observation/question. So first off, angels are subject to time. We spent a good bit of the last point that we were discussing talking about how God's spirituality is fundamentally different than angels, and that angels are still material. They're in the material creation. Well, so too with time. Angels, they don't see the future, so to speak. They are not outside of time. They are within time-space or space-time. Time-space isn't a word. Space-time, just how we are. And so that makes them, again, more similar to us than they are to God in this. Even though angels have different capabilities than we do, they are different creatures with different natures than we have. They are nonetheless still created creatures within space-time. And an interesting observation also related to this idea of how time works and God's externality to it is this idea of future prophecy in the Bible. And so sometimes it's just people are told what's going to happen. God tells them what is going to happen. Future events. But when we have this case of visions, so We might think about John with the book of Revelation, for example. Was it just that John was given, I don't know, like a movie, so to speak, of what was going to happen in the future? Or was John actually transported into the future, thereby seeing the events that were going to happen? I don't want to like punt on the question. To me, it sort of doesn't seem like the answer matters, because either way, in the book of Revelation, we are being given this description of future events, whether that is John was simply given to see the manifestation of what would happen, or whether he was actually somehow transported, picked up from, if you view time as a stream, picked up from one place in the stream and put in a future place in the stream and then brought back. I don't think it really changes the essence of the fact that the vision that John saw was the future. Audie, do you think that it has an impact, or should we take a stand on this?
Yeah, I don't think it really matters. It's an interesting question, and there are all sorts of interesting questions out there, even with us. Me personally, and Professor Robert has also confessed to having questions of all sorts that the Bible does not actually give answers to. I do remember how Ezekiel said that the Spirit lifted him by the locks of his head and took him to such and such a place, and he saw this and he saw that and all of that. So it's almost like they were transported forward in time to see things happening as they unfolded. Now, I don't really know or particularly care. The reason for that is this: we know that God has control of time. Whether he can pick you up from the present and transport you to the future so that you witness things happening, or he actually shows you things as they will happen in the future before they actually happen, I don't think it makes that big of a difference. We know that God controls time. He controls it. And we have two demonstrations in the Bible of God's control of time. He wound time back when he was speaking to Ahaz, the king, who was an unrighteous king of Judah who didn't want to listen to reason. And Isaiah said, well, this is how God will demonstrate to you that what he has said will happen. He caused the sundial to go back 10 degrees. Then there was Joshua, who was fighting. I think it was the Amalekites he was fighting. I don't remember whom he was fighting anymore. But during that battle, he basically paused time. Now, how that could possibly happen, that time would pause and everything would keep going as it was. I mean, go knock yourself out with the physics of it, but it did happen. That's what the Bible says. So all of that tells us that God does have the power to do whatever he wants with time. And as for space, the Lord Jesus could show up at any place whenever he wanted after he rose from the dead. And you couldn't keep him out with locked doors. So when you take all of that into account, there is nothing too hard for the Lord. He could totally cause a prophet to time travel. But I'm not sure, knowing that he did or didn't do it is going to really make that big of a difference to our understanding of the scriptures or of him. We do know that his power is absolute. So
yep. I think that is probably the best answer for us on this, is just either way, it does not really affect the fact that God is in complete control of time. It's not bad to ask questions, what I would call questions of curiosity. How exactly does this work? What does it mean for X, Y, Z? If the Bible doesn't talk about it, there are certain things that we just can't take hard, firm positions on. That doesn't mean that they aren't interesting in some respects, but it also kind of means that maybe it's not something that we're given to know. And that means that usually, I would say, as a rule of thumb, it's dangerous to spend lots of time on these things, just because, not that there's anything wrong being curious or asking questions, but if it was something that we needed to know, God would have given us information on it, right? Simple as that. So I think it's a very interesting question of, were prophets actually transported into the future, or did they just see visions of the future? How does that work? Who knows? Either way, God is in complete control of the flow of time. So I think that's a good place for us here. So just how God is in complete control of matter and all of the material things in the universe, God is in complete control of time because he is eternal and separate from it. And next, we'll be talking about the same deal except for space. All right, so as we just said, next we're just going to be talking about the exact same sort of concept that we have been with matter and time, except now with regards to space. So God's being transcends space. He's not limited or bounded by spatial issues or concerns. He's not subject to space in any way. And again, God is not confined by space because he created it and employs it however he desires. So we have the same idea of God being the creator, the one outside of creation who has the strings in his hands, so to speak. And so the idea that God is somehow bound by this thing that he himself made is just completely nonsensical on the face of it. And so Adi brought up an example when we were just talking about Jesus not being bound by space after the resurrection. And so the Gospels are clear that the disciples were in a room with a locked door, and then Jesus appeared among them. And so that's just one example here. But this is what we mean by God not being bound by space. Also, God can control things within space. He can, and this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy if you squint too hard at the physics behind it. So matter and space and time, they're all related in these equations that we don't need to go into. But the point is, all of it is creation. And God is not bound by his creation. And if you were to summarize the three things that we've been talking about here, matter, time, and space, is that all of these things are part of creation, and God is not part of creation. God exists before creation. I should say God exists, right? That's what his nature is. And God created what we now have around us, and he's not part of it. And that's really the fundamental basis of all three of these, is simply that God is not at all constrained by the things that constrain us in creation, because he is not himself a created creature. You have anything specifically related to space to bring up, Audie?
I don't think so, but I think you make a very solid point once you say, look, we're talking about that which isn't created. And I like to make a bit of a difference between the deity of the Trinity and the persons of the Trinity. The reason I make that difference is this, or the identity, I think, the identity of the Trinity, the identity of God and the deity of God. The reason I like to make that difference is the thing that makes a thing God is simply the isness of the thing, the fact that it just is. There is no explanation for its existence. There is no agent that speaks to why it exists. Nothing made it, and nothing can affect its existence. You can't change it in any way. You can't affect it in any way. That quality of deity, once we understand it, makes everything make all the sense in the world, because then it can't be creation. Creation does not possess that quality.
Mm-hmm.
And space does not possess that quality because black holes, for example. There are weird things that happen. We've been talking about the expansion of the universe because of how we are measuring the redshifts. I think that's what they call it.
Yeah, it's redshift.
Yeah. So we're measuring those things that tell us that something is happening to the very fabric of the universe in which we exist. Everything that we see changes, and change is a response to something external to whatever is changing. So if space itself is transforming, then space does not possess the quality of deity, and that which possesses the quality of deity cannot be subject to anything that is subject to change.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, we can comprehend all these arguments are essentially to say, look, the Bible makes sense because when you think about it, it makes sense. That's it. So
it's consistent, like you said, with drawing this distinction between deity being fundamentally distinct from creation. And creation cannot be deity. on this account. It's sort of, Lisa posted on the forum, I may get to that at some other point, but this idea that the universe is God is complete garbage because the universe changes and God doesn't change. Like, just on the surface of it, it doesn't work, right? And that's because God is being, God is unchanging, as Audie has just brought up, makes it fundamentally distinct from everything that is created in creation, including space, right? That's a good place to end our initial introduction to these. So next, we're going to be talking about how some of these attributes that we've discussed here, so the fact that God's spiritual, that he's eternal, and that he's immeasurable, make God unique among beings. And so that's what we're going to turn to next. All right, so when we say that God is unique, this kind of might seem like a no-duh teaching. Well, of course, there's only one God, right? We don't believe in a pantheon. And in fact, there only could be one God from a logical standpoint, right? Because if there are more than one, well, were they all equally existent? You have all these other sorts of issues. And interestingly, like pantheons never seem to kind of handle that so well. Like, do gods exist within other gods? Or they all kind of, if you squint hard at them enough, they have what I would call existential logical issues with how they work. But not so for us, because as we've just spent time discussing, deity exists external to creation. God is not part of creation. God is being. He's existence. He does not change. And so all that to say, it should be sort of self-evident that, well, there's only one being like that, and that being is God. And nothing that is created is at all like him. Because this characteristic of deity, like Audie has just pointed out, that is what makes God unique. Among other things, right? It has all these consequences that we've been going through with the spirituality, the fact that God is eternal, God is immeasurable, and the manifestations of those things in creation, which is what we'll look at next as we get through this section. But the whole point is that all of these things together mean that there is no one and nothing else like God. And that's what we mean when we say that God is unique. It comes from God's infinite nature. No one else in the universe can reasonably be compared to him. He's absolutely unique within creation, even though God's not bound by creation, right? As a person who acts within creation, no one has the properties that he has. No one has his infinite nature. And therefore, he is the one person to whom all honor is due, as the de facto ruler of creation by existential fiat. Well, it's kind of a mouthful, but it's saying that on account of who God is, his infinite nature, the fact that he is the creator, all creation owes him that honor and respect simply on account of who he is, because of these attributes that he has, right? We're saying that God's infinity illuminates his abilities. That was kind of the intro slide that God is going on this. They illuminate his abilities, and because of his abilities, because of his uniqueness, he is the de facto ruler of the universe. And so from the standpoint of his transcendence of the physical universe, God is unique by virtue of his spirituality, eternity, and immeasurability. And so this is kind of going to be the bridge here. And that's why this section, at least to my knowledge, that's why Dr. Luganville has laid out this section as he has, is because we're now going to be going from these three characteristics, which are the essential qualities of God, right? God is these things. Now, to our minds, we kind of have a hard time thinking of them external to the universe, but these are the qualities of God who make God who he is, kind of not in reference to the universe. And now we're going to be shifting our attention to the manifestations of these qualities as they relate to God's actions within the universe, within creation. And so God transcends the physical universe because he's spiritual, he's eternal, and he's immeasurable. But within how he relates to the physical universe, he is supreme within the physical universe in that he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And those three, if you think about them, actually correspond to these other attributes that we've just gone over. So God is omnipotent because he can affect whatever he wants in the physical universe with matter because he is external to it, right? He's not bound by the laws that govern the rest of matter in the universe because God created matter. Same deal with omniscience. If God sees the end from the beginning, well, of what consequence is time to God? And this is why God knows everything, because from the beginning to the end, and even that which was not, has not been, the hypothetical, so to speak, God knows it all because God is external to time. And the omnipresence, well, if you can't contain God in one place, that's what it means that God is everywhere, because God is simply not a created creature. He's not bound by these rules of the universe that govern all other created beings. Now, I made this chart here. The study doesn't have it. This is just stuff directly out of the study. And this can be helpful. Visual aids can be helpful for us kind of having an easier way to track some of the things that we're talking about here. So when we say that God is unique, we say he's unique because he's spiritual rather than being bound by matter. And how that manifests in creation is that he's omnipotent. God may affect material creation however he pleases. And when we say that he's eternal rather than being bound by time, that means that God's omniscient. God knows everything in creation from beginning to end, and even that which could have been. He's immeasurable rather than being bound by space, and that manifests as him being omnipresent. He's ever present in creation as far as the east is from the west, so nothing can separate us from God and the love of God. This is kind of the scripture I'm paraphrasing there. And so all this together means that while we may not be properly able to fully grasp God's true nature, since we ourselves are small finite beings bound by space-time, it should nonetheless be clearly apparent to us that it's not possible for any other created creature to compare with the Creator. And that's simply because no other creature is outside of these limitations like God is. So even creatures far more powerful than ourselves, so Satan and the other angels, they are bound and limited in ways God is not. And so that leaves God completely alone and unique in his transcendence of and supremacy within the physical universe. And this right here, this is why we say that God is unique. So, Adi, do you have any points you want to say about kind of what we've gone through here? This kind of bridge, the transition between these essential qualities of God we've been going to, and then how they manifest within creation.
Yeah, the first thing I want to say about that is the reason that there is even a question or there is any mention of God's uniqueness is that is actually the whole point of all the fighting, so to speak, the war in creation. Because Satan essentially went, why should he have it and I don't get to have it? And every sin that we commit, everything that all the issues of sin that we have arise from a heart that says, why does God get to be God and I don't get to be God? Because the idea is, what makes him so special? I can also make my own choices. I can also determine what I will be. And we must remember that this is why we are in the image of God, that we possess the ability to self-determine. We have the ability to self-define. So we can say, this is what I want to be relative to God. That's what free will really is, that we possess the ability to define or explain ourselves relative to God. And because we possess that, and this is exactly why the argument you just made for how there cannot be more than one God makes all the sense in the world. Creature rebellion is absolute proof that there can only be one God, because if there are more than one, creation would not exist. They would be at loggerheads all the time, and they would essentially either want to create multiple universes, and as long as they're in conflict, they cannot have this. They can't let anything else exist. They would be locked in eternal conflict forever. But we know that there are three persons of God, and these three persons of God are in perfect unity. And that is also proof for why there is one God. Because if they are all in perfect unity, they cannot be multiple gods in the sense of possessing multiple wills, multiple desires, multiple projections and expectations and whatnot. The very essence of Godhead, of deity, is that I am that which is not affected by anything outside of myself. And if more than one God exists, they would have issues with affecting each other.
Yeah, I mean, I almost don't think, to a certain extent, that we have to go worry ourselves with arguing against the concept, because to some extent, Scripture is clear that there is one God, right?
Yes,
Even
absolutely.
Old Testament got that. So I'm not saying that we can't talk about it. It's just
Yeah.
to us
We're
that's
not
the
going,
important part.
yeah, we're not going into that. The reason that this is actually raised is to explain the matter of the uniqueness of God, why we're even talking about it. That uniqueness is the point of all the fighting we're having. Because as long as a creature can say, I can be God too, then what's special about God? And that's why the Bible is shaped the way it is. I think I had a conversation. Yes, I had a conversation with someone on my way back from church today, and I had to tell her, I don't present and I don't believe that the Bible is a manual of instruction. So I don't teach you what to do and what not to do and what is right and what is not right. I teach you who God is so that you see how different he is from you and from everybody else. You get to know his plan so that you know exactly what he's aiming to accomplish as a thing that's different from what you are aiming to accomplish and what everybody else is aiming to accomplish. In other words, I'm showing you the uniqueness of God. And that's the point. That's the point. Satan could say, I will ascend to, and I will make my own place. I will be like the Most High, as if you can be like him. You are not like him, not even remotely. So, and that's the point. So, like you said, all of these other qualities that came into play, they essentially demonstrate his uniqueness in all sorts of ways. That is absolutely true. They show his transcendence over creation, but more importantly, they show his transcendence over us. That is me personally. This is the difference between me and God. And this is why he gets to say what should be. And I get to say, I'd like to go with you. I agree with you. I submit to what you want. I will work with you to accomplish it because I don't know half the things you know everything. And I don't have half the power you have. You have all the power. Whatever you don't do doesn't get done. I can't be everywhere at once to accomplish my will. And again, look, when he tested Job, these things are what he brought to bear. He showed him, look at the difference between me and you. You think you're so wise. You think you're so smart that you can even judge me. Now, can you do this? Can you do that? Do you understand this? Do you know that? Have you been here? Have you been there? Do you know where the snow comes from and all of that stuff? He was essentially saying, look at the gulf, the wide gulf between who you are and who I am. And when you see that for what it is, do you really think you can judge me? Can you sit in judgment of God? So this is why we're interested at all in the talk about God's uniqueness. We're essentially saying it is impossible for there to be more than one God. We are certainly not candidates for that other God that should be. And Satan is most definitely not a candidate for the other God that ought to be. There is only one. Every other claim to deity, to godhood, is a lie. That's what this is about.
Because they can never have these attributes that we're talking about. Only a being who created what currently exists, who's outside of it, can have these attributes. Nothing that exists within creation can be spiritual, truly, like separate from creation, right? Nothing that exists within time can be separate from time. It doesn't make sense, right? It's impossible. And so this is the madness, the existential futility of Satan's rebellion. And, as the Satanic Rebellion series on Ichthus talks about, this idea that humans have about, I am like God, God needs me, that progression of self-delusion. Again, the insanity of this, as Audie is pointing out, the reason why we talk about the uniqueness of God is because this uniqueness that we're talking about, it means that we owe God. God is the one who controls the universe. And because of that, he's the one with all the authority in the universe, not us. We don't control the things like God does. And for that reason, God's uniqueness gives him de facto rulership and supremacy within the universe. Because, among other things, no one can oppose him. Not really. Even Satan's plan, Satan's only dancing in the palm of God's hand. Because Satan can do nothing that God does not allow to happen. There is no battle between good and evil where you have stakes that you're not sure who wins. God won from the time that history first started. There is no competition, so to speak. And that's because God is unique within the universe. No one can compare to him. No one has these attributes except for him. So I think that's where we'll conclude this. I mean, obviously, this bridge that we've spent talking about here, going from these essential qualities of God to how they manifest in creation as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, but we're going to be talking about those things next. But that's kind of how this section works, in taking us from the one to the other, talking about how these things make God unique by nature, and no one can compare to him on that account. So I think that's where we're going to stop here, and we will be picking up next talking about omnipotence. All right, so having just talked about how God is unique, and he's unique on account of his spirituality giving him complete dominion over material things in creation, his externality to time, his eternity giving him complete knowledge of things in creation, and his immeasurability giving him the ability to be present at all places in creation. Those latter three things, that's what we're going to be focusing on now, starting with omnipotence, this idea that because God is outside of space-time, he can control everything within space-time. It's his right. His ability to do this is because he can affect whatever changes he wants within the material realm. Nothing can transpire except that which God happens or allows to happen based on the free will decisions of others. Therefore, there is no deed, nor was there ever, nor will there ever be, which God is unable to do, small or great, within material creation. And so I wanted to start off a bit of the discussion that we have here, talking about this question that you may have heard posed. Something like, so could God create a rock so big even he couldn't lift it? Sometimes this comes up somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Sometimes people are actually serious in raising this as an objection. And so this is supposedly pitting two aspects of omnipotence against each other. So on the one side, God's ability to create anything he wishes, ex nihilo, that's Latin, it means out of nothing. So for God's ability to create, versus God's strength, his ability to do things, to manipulate material creation. And so the people who make this argument, they argue that the two superlatives mandated by omnipotence contradict each other. So supposedly, if God cannot create an object too heavy for him to lift, he's not omnipotent, because an omnipotent creature would be able to create anything. And likewise, if there would exist some object that God could create, but he was unable to lift, then he also would not be omnipotent, because an omnipotent creature would be able to lift everything. So people who make this argument, they kind of say something like, see, either way, he can't do something, therefore he's not omnipotent. Now, of course, we don't agree with this argument as Christians, and I'm about to explain why. And this is one reason why apologetics, just as a side tangent, is best engaged in with those who have the gifts, the requisite gifting from God, empowerment of the Holy Spirit, and proper preparation to handle things like this appropriately. Because it's easy to get confused and tripped up and maybe not give as convincing an answer as we ought as Christians when confronted with objections to the truth. Because this truth that we're talking about, this is an objection to the idea of God's omnipotence. That's kind of why I'm bringing it up, just to highlight, no, really, God is omnipotent, what we mean by that. Okay, so how do we handle this supposed situation of contradiction that people bring up? So we can let people who don't want to believe, we can kind of let them go on their way. And this is kind of what I mean by, we don't always have to take up this debate, especially if maybe it's not the right thing for you to do in a second. But also, and more to the point here, it's not our job to convince people. If people are going to not believe in God because of this, there's almost nothing we can do. Their hearts are already closed off to the truth. And you'll see what I mean in a second here. And so to answer this, it's obvious, I'm going to emphasize it again, obvious that God can both create whatsoever he wishes and also manipulate creation in whatever way he wishes. That's what we mean when we say that God's omnipotent. So the idea of a material object that he cannot create is definitionally impossible, right? It cannot happen. And so too is a material object he cannot manipulate, that he cannot change, he cannot affect within creation. So lifting the rock in this case. So put differently, there is no such thing as an object he could create but not lift, or an object he could lift but not create. That thing just doesn't exist. The entire objection here is circular by assuming that such a thing can exist to begin with. And so when we say that, that means that people who they raise this point, they think they're so clever for this. They've already put God in a box from the very beginning. They're already limiting what he can do just by the very way they phrase this. And then they only proceed to smugly knock down nothing but a straw man. So they're not even addressing the real points in hand. And again, that's because anything that God could create, he could lift by definition. There is no such thing as an object where he can do one but not the other. And so I might say, okay, Stephen, why are we talking about this, right? I'm not that interested. I don't raise that objection. So the reason is because it kind of helps throw into relief what God can do, right? This is not what we have in our heads. We don't have these logic puzzles. When we say that God's omnipotent, we know that God can do anything, whatever anything might be. God can do it, whatever it may be. And so with that, we follow El Shaddai, God Almighty, the leader of angel hosts, he who was and is to come, the person who holds the very strings of the universe in his hands and can create or annihilate galaxies in the blink of an eye. That's what we mean when we are talking about omnipotence, not this hypothetical creature who might be able to create a rock, right? We're talking about the king of the universe, the creator of everything that exists. And we'd better fear that power and majesty as we ought to keep our own lives in perspective. And so just to use a progression here to emphasize the point. So as human beings, we are tiny compared to the vastness of just Earth, much less our solar system, much less our galaxy, much less the universe itself. But God is even bigger, infinitely bigger, in fact, because he's not bound by it, than the universe itself. And God could snuff out everything that exists in the blink of an eye if he decided to. And so that is the kind of power in view when we speak of God being omnipotent. Not that he actually will snuff out the universe on a whim, but that it would be absolutely nothing for him to do so, because he is in complete control of matter, time, and space, and things only exist because he causes them to exist. It's not like they exist independent from his will. And so to tie us back, I don't know if other people find this interesting or satisfying on an intellectual level to knock down arguments like this. But when we say God's omnipotent, God really can do anything within material creation because he controls it. And so this idea that he couldn't do something, whatever skepticism or doubt that people might express on this is just misplaced because God is not in any way bound by material creation. And so as in this example, it simply means that people come in already thinking of God as a limited creature, as something bound by the rules in which we operate. And that's just the wrong way to go about it, because God is completely separate from the rules that govern all of creation. So, sorry, I rambled a bit there, but this was something that I just thought it was worth us talking about as we examine this idea of omnipotence. So, Audie, do you have anything you want to riff on from what I've said or other points you want to make on omnipotence itself?
Let me say first of all that regarding the question you addressed, the first time I heard it in 2012, I'd never heard anything of that sort. And my fellow apologists then and we used to people used to mistake us for each other on Nairaland then. I used to call him my twin because it seemed like we thought exactly the same. His answer to that question was, that's a word salad. It means exactly nothing. Mm-hmm. Like you can't explain, you can't define what you're talking about. What's a rock that God can't lift? So something like that. Yeah. So I know what is behind it. The idea is it's exactly like saying, can God create a square circle? Because, well, God can do anything and do everything. So he must be able to do something completely nonsensical. So the answer that I find in the scriptures for such things, first of all, is there is nothing that God can't do. And the first person to find out how wrong he was about what God can do and can't do was the wisest creature that God ever made. The one who should have been telling everybody, just don't mess with him. He knows things you don't even begin to imagine. Like he's already thought about what you have not yet begun to imagine or conceive in your heart. That's the person who first thought, I can box God into a corner. I can put him in a catch-22 where his hands are tied. He thought, well, I can't beat God in an actual fight. I can't go to war with God and win. He's too powerful. But I could outsmart him. That was Satan. And how did that turn out for him? Well, you see, this is where things get a little annoying for people like me. We live in trivial times. That means Jesus has come and died on the cross. The miracle has happened. So it's easy to trivialize. We don't see the marvel of this thing. We don't see the enormity of this miracle, that God can forgive a sinner. That God can forgive a sinner. That's what Satan said was impossible. That he could put them in a position where if he forgave a sinner, he would be acting unjustly. And if he punished a sinner, he would be negating his character of love. He thought he had won. And then God did this Jesus thing, and all of a sudden Satan is looking like a complete idiot. Now, those who say could he create a rock that he can't live, they sound real smart. And after all, they're speaking English. Most of us who speak English can make sense of the words that they just used. And it sounds like, I mean, could he? I mean, if he creates a rock, then, and he can't lift it, well, he can create a rock, but now he can't lift it. Where is it? It's like, oh, wow. And your head is blown, right? Like you've just made so much sense. You've boxed God into a corner. Now he can't exist. Precisely what Satan thought. I can put him in a situation where he will be forced to abandon creation and I get to rule over it. We really can't win. There's something that God said, that Paul said through the Spirit in 2 Timothy chapter 2. He said, if you deny him, he won't deny himself. So are there things God can do? Absolutely. He won't lie. He can't lie. He can't deny himself. There are all sorts of things God can do. None of them is a reflection on his power. All of them are a reflection on his character. There are lots of things God can do. But if we're talking about what his omnipotence actually means, it doesn't mean he can create a rock that he can't lift. His omnipotence means there is absolutely nothing that God could want to do that he can't do. Nothing. Mm-hmm. Like if God decided right now, I want to create a square circle, he can create a square circle. It doesn't make any kind of sense to us, but I wouldn't bet against him.
Well, so I don't even want to go there.
I'm going to create a rock that I can't lift. Yeah, it's another nonsensical thing to imagine, but I wouldn't bet against him if he decided that he wanted to do that. That's the...
Well, but the whole point of why I framed this how I did was that the question itself is circular, that there is no such object, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's the whole thing in this, is that now I will say, scripture that comes to mind when we deal with this, again, is this idea of answering fools according to their folly. I wouldn't even give people who make this argument the time of day most of the time. They're not interested, right? No matter what you say, they're not going to listen to you. But the whole point of this is that the point that I was trying to make when I brought this up was simply that we cannot, in our thinking, put God in a box and then speak of his power in terms of the boxed version of God. We need to appreciate how big God is, right?
Yeah, that's precisely right. There is nothing wrong with the answer that you gave. It's actually where I'm starting from, which is essentially this. You don't know what God can or cannot do. So shut it. That's where you start. Then, what is God's omnipotence? The Bible is very clear. There is nothing that God could possibly want to do that he can't do. Nothing can stop him in all of creation. And this is what Satan keeps learning time and time again. And everybody that wants to oppose God, I mean, right now they're going bonkers because of technology, because of science. For the past 500 years, we've been doing miracles that they didn't think was possible. Now we've gone to the moon. We have launched all sorts of machines into space. We're exploring things that our great-grandfathers didn't even know existed. All sorts of things are happening in the world today, and people have lost their freaking minds. They think, now, I'm God, right? Because can God do all this stuff? I mean, they're forgetting that all those things existed before they even learned how to, put anything together and send it to the moon. The moon was already there. How did it get there? Oh, it was evolution, right? The nothing that exploded and became everything, right? So, but for us who believe, what we know from the scriptures is this: there is nothing that God cannot do if he wants to do it. So if you create a logical impossibility, I wouldn't bet on you winning against God. Assuming, of course, and what I'm assuming is that there is any kind of sense in what you're saying. Now, when Satan made his bet against the Lord and encouraged his fellow angels to join him in that bet, I'm absolutely sure that why he was persuaded he would win, and the third of the angels that agreed with him thought that they would win, was that they were persuaded that this was an actual logical impossibility. If God is just and if God is loving, well, we can get away with sin because you can't reconcile those two things. Well, God did. He did. So again, I would say, I have no idea the limits, and this is the most important thing. I have no idea what the limits are to God's power. I have no idea. So if you create something that sounds absolutely idiotic and you think, this is where I've caught God, I've put him in a box, he can't win in this one, I'm not betting on you against the Lord. I'm simply not. Now, if you said, well, I bet you the Lord cannot lie. Yeah, he said so. I won't fight you on that one. He can't lie. If you say that God cannot deny himself, sure, I'm with you on that. I'll bet on you any day of the week, every day of the week, everything I've got, God cannot deny himself. But you see, if there is anything the Bible does not say God can do, and that we can't reason from the Bible that he can't do, and you think it's some kind of logical impossibility, yeah, I'm not going with you on that. I'm never going to put that on you.
We have plenty of counter examples of that going real poorly, like you said. Now, I will say that these arguments that you've been bringing up, like can God sin, can God lie, can God deny himself, those are of a little bit different character. So the particular logical trap here, this whole rock business, I brought up as an example of one of those arguments that we don't even have to wave our hand at. Like the argument is literally, it assumes things and it's circular in that regard. That's the point I tried to make. Some of the other things, this idea of, well, if God can't sin, couldn't an all-powerful being sin, therefore God can't exist sort of thing. The problem with those is just that their definition of what all-powerful is, like, where are they getting it from, right? This is always why defining terms is important. Now, I don't want to go down the apologetics rabbit trail. I didn't want to get a super sidetrack. Again, I was bringing this up sort of as a point to examine this idea of boxing God. And whenever we think that God is limited in some way, we better revise our thinking. I think we've talked about it well, right? We've used good examples. Your example of Satan thinking that he caught God in this way to that God couldn't somehow reconcile sinners to himself. That was Satan's PR campaign, if you will. It's a great example of what not to do, right? Of trusting somehow that God can't do something. Whatever you're thinking, you're probably wrong because God is in complete control. He knows way better than we do about everything that happens in the universe. So, with that, maybe we'll see if anyone has any questions on this before we move on to the next one. So this, again, is on the idea of omnipotence. All right, so that's probably where we'll pivot from talking about God's omnipotence to his omniscience. And so we've spent all this time talking about, well, what can God do? And now we're going to talk about what does God know? That's going to be the next thing that we focus on. All right, so as to omniscience, here's the text coming straight out of the study. We have the idea that God is all-knowing, irrespective of time. So again, this is how this corresponds to God being eternal and outside of time, is that God knows everything irrespective of time. He knows the end from the beginning. He can affect anything he desires in the temporal realm. Therefore, God knows, always has known, and always will know everything, the end from the beginning. As the everlasting one, his knowledge of every event that has or will or even could occur within his creation is comprehensive and absolute. So a specific phrase that I wanted to pick out here is this could occur business. So it's not just knowing everything that has and is and will occur, but everything that could have occurred as well. So I do not want to get too off in the weeds of the theological thing. People give this a label, the so-called Molinism with a capital M, M-O-L-I-N-I-S-M, and this idea of middle knowledge. That's just the theological jargon here. I actually don't particularly like bogging ourselves down in the theological arguments that have happened over this. There's a reasonably famous apologist in our day. His name is William Lane Craig. He is a prominent proponent of this particular doctrine. I kind of like to talk about it independent from that. So the example that I thought we'd bring up to talk about this idea of God knowing things that didn't just happen or that like happened in the past or will happen in the future, but things kind of that this would have, could have, hypothetical sort of thing, is when the Bible says that God will never test us past what we can bear. So that's 1 Corinthians 10:13. I could actually read full reference here. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Now, the Greek word here that is translated as temptation in the NASB is also translated as testing. Depending on context is how you know whether it's temptation or testing. So this one could actually kind of go either way, that God will not test us past what we are able to bear. But the idea is, well, how does God know what we're able to bear? And the verse here implicitly requires that God knows where our limits are. How does God know that if it happens before we have actually done something? And this is where you get into this idea of this knowledge that God has is so complete that it even covers these situations past that which actually has or will occur. Hence, middle knowledge. Again, I don't particularly like bogging ourselves down in some of the history, so to speak, here, but it's necessary for God to know what test we are and are not able to bear. He has to know whether we would or would not pass a test were he to give it to us, right? Seems kind of like common sense. Another example you can use is divine discipline. How does God know what discipline is necessary for us, right? He has to know what discipline will best lead to turning us back to him, right? To basically corresponding to the free will decisions we make in life. Well, since we're all different, we have these different makeups, talents, aptitudes, opinions, everything. So the discipline with which, anyone who's had kids can probably relate to this. The way in which you discipline one child may need to be different than the way in which you discipline another. So very incorrigible little boys, for example, may need a much sterner talking to than their more sensitive younger sisters, for example. Just not to generalize based on gender too much, but sometimes people need a good bit more discipline because they're a little bit more resistant to it. So God knows all of this perfectly. He knows exactly what we need and what would and would not work with each of us specifically. All of this knowledge that we're getting at here, this is God's knowledge of that which could be, of the hypothetical. And for whatever reason, some of this is controversial theologically. So to me, these examples I've raised, 1 Corinthians 10:13, God will not test us past what I can bear, seems just kind of like it makes sense for God to have this knowledge. It's necessary for him to act in this way that everything is perfectly mapped out, right? We believe in the foreordination of all events before the beginning of human history. And so God's perfect foreordination logically requires that he know everything about all potential paths in the mind-bogglingly complex decision tree that spans the history of the entire universe. So that's a really jargony way of saying that all of these potentials that we're talking about, for God's plan to be perfect, he has to have already taken all of that into account. So it's kind of always puzzled me why people would ever think to argue against this. This is just how big God's knowledge is. This is what it means when we say he's omniscient. But alas, some people do argue against this, right? And hypothesis, theory, I don't know. I cannot look into the hearts of people, but perhaps it's because believing that God knows even these things requires us to appreciate how truly big and unlike us, who, with our very finite perspective that we have here within space-time, how unlike us God really is. Because for us, this sort of knowledge is completely impossible for us to have. We can't know what would or could happen were this event or that event to happen in our lives. We can't predict that. We have no idea. But God does, because he's God, because he's external to creation. And so for now, again, another thing that I'm raising here, you should just mostly ignore the fact in my opinion, that some people have again tried to put God into a box in their minds, right? So we talked about this with omnipotence. We're talking about it with omniscience. People who say, well, God can't know that. That's, it doesn't make sense. It's not logical, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you should kind of ignore the fact that some people do put God in a box in their minds and content yourself with the sure confidence that God knows everything. And when we say everything, that is unbounded. We mean everything. Absolutely everything, inclusive of our free will decisions before we even make them. It's foreknowledge. And God is also so infinitely wise as to have perfectly mapped out all of creature history before the universe was even created. God's plan perfectly captures everything from beginning to end. There are no mistakes. There is nothing that could happen that would be better than that which has already been foreordained. And so this divine plan being worked out around us, God knows what he's doing. He's not going to make mistakes, and we need to have faith and trust in that. So again, kind of introducing a way in which people box God, in which they're not willing to accept that God knows everything. And when we say everything, we mean it, everything. So Adi, you want to bounce anything off of what I've said here?
Yeah, I think the real sum of it is really God's knowledge is perfect. The Bible bears that out. And whenever we go into a lot of the philosophy, I know why Molinism exists. It's one of the answers to trying to reconcile how God knows everything and yet we have free will. It's one of those theologies. And like you said, there's quite a bit of getting into for that, but I think I can say rather simply here that first of all, the Bible is absolutely clear that God's knowledge is perfect. There is no need to accommodate some imperfection in God's knowledge. If he has imperfect knowledge, he's not God. We should remember again that what God is by nature is that which is. And that is why the Bible tells us that his name is I will be what I am, or I am what I will be. He's unaffected by time. If his knowledge is affected by time, then that definition becomes untrue. If he has to learn things, that definition becomes untrue. If his knowledge depreciates, loses value or quality over time, that definition becomes untrue. So he either has perfect knowledge or he is not God. And this is actually how we can tell when something is not the true God. It's one of the ways we can tell that that thing does not have perfect knowledge. That's why we can know, for example, that even a soothsayer who can predict, like it was happening with the slave girl who had the spirit of divination, right? We could still say, even with that demonstration of power that is beyond human ability, that was still not God. We can tell that because, like God said through one of the prophets, bring your diviners, bring your gods. Let's see who can predict the end from the beginning, like I can. So God's knowledge is perfect. That's not a question. Molinism and questions of hypothesis, what could be, what would be, and all of that stuff. My answer to that is still, God knows everything. And Jesus did demonstrate that matter of what could be when he talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. And yeah.
That is one of the proof texts. And this is why I didn't want to get into. People argue about this very long and erudite, but the idea that we're introducing here, like Audie said, is just that when we say God's knowledge is perfect, we mean it. Every down to the last dregs of the logical implication of that, so to speak. And
yeah, and here's
we just need to speak as if we actually believe that, because people in their heads, again, they try to put God in a box. They try to say, well, but, and the answer is no. Like Audie said, God's knowledge is perfect and complete from the beginning to the end.
So I would say this: a lot of times in matters of discussing the Bible, people don't discuss the Bible. They want to talk philosophy. And here's the thing. We have to be, look, philosophy is good if it is good philosophy. And as a matter of fact, what we consider good philosophy is the Bible. So if the Bible says it, it's true. The Bible doesn't say it's suspect at best. It's suspect at best. So if someone shows up and starts going into the ins and outs about why this or that is logical, I'm listening for, yeah, the Bible actually does say or doesn't say. If I don't hear that, I don't really care what you're saying. So if you're insisting that if he knew, then this, if he didn't know, then that, what I really don't care. The question I want to hear, or what I want to hear from you is, the Bible says this or doesn't say that. That's all. So as far as I'm concerned, the Bible is clear about God's perfect knowledge and complete knowledge. There is no question about whether God knows everything or doesn't know. Peter himself said it to Jesus Christ, you know all things, you know that I love you. So when God is asking us questions, he's not seeking information. That's very obvious. So having said that, all questions that arise from if God knows, we have to understand the answer is not in he probably doesn't. That's not where the answer to that question is. If the question is, how do I reconcile the fact that God has perfect knowledge to this, then there's a third piece that you're missing. You need to find that. You cannot solve that problem by reducing what God knows, because then you would make him less than God. That's the end that I can, yeah.
No, I mean, and like I said, not going to go down the full rabbit trail there. You brought up the Sodom and Gomorrah passage. There's other arguments. I mean, I made mine using the testing passage here from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. More the point is that the people who want to limit God, to say that God can't know these things somehow, that it's logically impossible, where are they getting that from? Right? It's the same issue with the whole thing that we talked about the limits people place upon God's omnipotence, is that the limits that people who argue against this, I'm not even so pro all the arguments that people use for this particular teaching, insofar as it just means that when we say God knows everything, we really do mean everything. Everything that has and is and will or could have, or everything in between, right? Because he's God. And we just have to respect that. That's all. And so that is omniscience. God knows the end from the beginning. God is in complete control of everything that has and is and will happen in the universe, because God's plan is perfect. It spans time from beginning to end, because God knows all. That's omniscience. I think that's where we'll cut for omniscience. And next, we're going to talk about omnipresence. All right, so now that we've finished our discussion here of omniscience, talking about how, just like with omnipotence, some people kind of put God in a box in their minds. They, right from the outset, don't view him kind of as this being separate from space-time, but they try to contextualize him in terms of the way we might understand very powerful creatures that are still part of our universe. Well, in the same way, people might not always appreciate that God is absolutely everywhere within creation. So God is ever present, irrespective of space. He can affect anything he desires in the spatial realm. Therefore, God has the ability, has always had and always will have, to be anywhere and everywhere, local and universal. And this is within creation, within the universe. Now, this note is me. This isn't directly from the study. This is something I wrote. I just say, of particular note is that this means that God sees all. He sees everything that happens within creation. Nobody can sneak anything past God. And on that great day of days, on Judgment Day before the throne, all will be revealed. This also means, as a practical note, that it's completely futile to try to run away from God. So like Jonah from the book of Jonah, we will find that no matter where we go, God and his purposes for us will always be there too. So because God is ever present in the world, no matter where we might try to escape, to run, to hide from the things that God has for us, we will never be able to, because God is at all places at all times, because he's God. So, Audie, do you have any points you want to make? I think maybe this is among the more straightforward of the characteristics of God that we've gone over here. But interested to hear if you have things to say.
I don't think there is much more to say there. It's just that God is not limited by space. He created it. He exists without it. or he existed without it until he made it, and he absolutely controls it. So he can do whatever he wants with it, and he's not limited by it. I think that's a I wouldn't say a more correct way to put it, but a more uh, all-embracing way to put it, in the sense that God is not limited by space. So one might be thinking in terms of, if he's everywhere, is he in hell? But then we talk about the lake of fire being God casting people away from his presence. So what does that mean? What we mean, the Bible never uses the word omnipresent, but it does say things like, where can I go away from you? If I make my bed in hell, there you are as well. But of course, hell in that sense is Sheol, the place of the dead. Regardless, the point is, there is no place in the universe, in all of creation, that is outside of God's reach. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think bringing up the point of so-called biblical geography, Ichthus has a chart. I don't remember exactly which study, but of like the third heaven separated by the universe from like the waters above, and then we have the universe, and then hell and the lake of fire. Jesus went into Sheol, like you said, the grave, when he descended, before he ascended on the third day. And that's different than the lake of fire, where the devil and fallen angels and unbelievers will go at the end of time. So-called, again, biblical geography here. But regardless, like you said, the point is God's not limited by space or spatial concerns. And so for us, practically as human beings, well, we don't have to worry about any of that stuff that happens after we die at the moment. In how we live our lives, it is just true that God is always before us. And we should actually view this more as a comfort than as a bad thing, as someone snooping on us, because this means that nothing can separate us from God. We have this verse, I know Paul wrote it, maybe it's Philippians, I don't remember, like nothing can separate us from the love of God. As far as the east is from the west, that sort of thing. God is always with us. And that should be a supreme comfort to us, probably more than anything else. All right, so just to run through the things that we've talked about here in this lesson, examining the nature of God. So we have talked first about God's essential characteristics, how he is spiritual, eternal, and immeasurable in a spatial sense. And then how that manifests within creation is him being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And we spent a good bit of our time in the study talking about how God is unique. And because no other being in all of creation, or outside of creation, right? Because we believe there's one God and that God made space-time. No one is like God. No one in the universe can reasonably be compared to him. He's absolutely unique, and therefore the person to whom all honor is due. And so he transcends the physical universe through these characteristics, and within the physical universe, he is supreme within it, because he is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And so this is how we view God with respect to his infinite nature. And if you remember at the beginning of this lesson, we had been emphasizing that God's infinite nature illuminates his abilities, what things God can do, how he interacts with creation. And in the next lesson, we are going to pick up talking about God's perfect character and what that says about his motives.